A few weeks ago, I moved to a sleepy little town called Meadow Lakes in Alaska. It's about an hour north of Anchorage. I'll admit, as a software developer, I never thought I'd be living in a remote town in Alaska, seemingly 1,000 miles from anywhere. But I just couldn't refuse the offer. This hot new AI startup based in none other than San Francisco was looking to break new ground by gathering real-world data for remote regions of the world that have been mostly untouched by technology. The project pitch certainly sounded interesting to me, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit the main driver was a free house and a $250,000 salary. The move couldn't have been easier. I still lived with my parents, so there wasn't much for the movers to pick up and take to the new house. And my amazing new salary meant I could realistically buy whatever I needed. It was a 2-day trip from the East Coast to Anchorage, from which I simply had an hour's drive to my new home. When I finally arrived around noon on the second day of my travel, I was pleasantly surprised to find that not only did all my stuff make it to the house, but it was fully furnished as well. A kitchen full of appliances, a living room with a sectional, and a recliner. Admittedly, I only cared about the recliner. The only thing missing was a bed. Not a big deal for me, since I was known to fall asleep in my chair back home anyways. No sense in changing habits now. Just as I had come back downstairs from touring the rest of my new house, which was entirely too big for a bachelor such as myself, I heard a knock at the door. Upon answering the knock, I was greeted by a rather skinny, middle-aged man with dark hair and one of the goofiest smiles I'd ever seen. "Good morning, mister," the man said cheerfully. "You must be the newcomer everyone's been talking about. Anyways, my name's Lenny Stringer, and I'm your new neighbor just next door. Feel free to stop by and ask for anything at all." Lenny said this in the sweetest demeanor, with the most childlike innocence about him. Then, Lenny's face immediately switched to a more serious look. And most importantly, do not, under any circumstances, answer the door at 12:04. After exchanging pleasantries with Lenny, I mentioned that I was tired from all the traveling, but I'd connect with him later in the week. Not answering the door at 12:04 seemed oddly specific, but Lenny seemed kind of strange in other ways, so perhaps he was just warning me about people causing trouble late at night. This was a rather remote region of the country, after all. I had spent the remainder of the day unpacking the few boxes of things I had moved in from my parents' house, just to get it all out of the way. If I hadn't done so immediately, anything left in a box probably would have stayed that way. The sun had set at this point, and I was settling into my new recliner, dozing off. It felt as if my eyes had only been closed for 5 minutes when I jumped awake, nearly falling out of my chair, at the sound of a loud banging at the front door. Without thinking, I quickly walked over and opened the door. "You didn't even look at the time, did you? Do you want to ruin your life?" Lenny said in an oddly terrified voice. Whatever nonsense he was spewing at this point, he certainly seemed to believe it. "All right, Lenny, I'll pay close attention to the time next time," I said in a rather condescending and annoyed tone. Lenny walked away with a nod as I closed the front door and made for my chair. Although Lenny's interruption was rather irritating, I've always had a knack for quickly falling back asleep more often than not. This time must not have been much different from the usual, because I barely remember reclining my chair before passing back out. This time must not have been much different from usual, because I barely remember reclining in my chair before passing back out. I was once again yanked out of a deep slumber by the sound of someone ham-fistedly knocking at my door. This time I looked at my watch, and sure enough, it said 12:04 a.m. Clearly, Lenny was committed to whatever fantasy was going on inside of his mind, but my patience was wearing thin, and I fully planned on letting him know exactly how I felt about getting woken up by nonsense twice in the same night. A few moments later, I decided to walk up to the front door and say, "Lenny, come on, I know it's you. I remembered your silly little warning about 12:04, so there." I waited to answer. "Now can you stop knocking on my door so I can get some peace and quiet?" The knocking had immediately stopped, and there was nothing but silence. Completely uninterested in seeing Lenny's face again, I turned around back towards the living room. Upon taking the first step away from the front door, I heard a chilling voice that seemed like it was Lenny. "Please, I'm not playing this time. Something is wrong. I don't feel right." Annoyed at how much I cared about a man I had only just met, I opened the door. Except there was no one around. I flicked on the floodlight, and there was no signs of movement in any direction. "This needs to stop, Lenny," I yelled in both anger and frustration. Upon receiving no response, I backed up to the kitchen and slammed the door shut. I told myself if Lenny knocks again, I'm immediately going to call the police and let them sort it out. Upon turning around, I felt like my heart stopped as my eyes caught sight of a dark figure rushing towards me. Before I could react, something hit me in the head, and everything cut to black. I was awakened the next morning on the kitchen floor with a hell of a headache, but my primary focus was immediately dialing 911 and connecting with the local sheriff. I told the sheriff about my neighbor attacking me in my own home last night, and to my surprise, he was there with a few other squad cars in about 15 minutes. As I frantically started explaining to the sheriff about Lenny, his stupid greeting and warning, and the fact that he attacked me in my own home, the sheriff cut me off. "Listen, there's a lot to unpack here," said the sheriff in an authoritative but understanding voice. "You'll want to come with me to the station to clarify a few things, submit an official statement, and sign some paperwork. I can drive you." This seemed a little odd to me, but who was I to question a small-town sheriff? After all, he and his team were quite responsive to my call. When we arrived at the station, the sheriff said, "First things first, we need to make sure we're looking for the right guy. Look at the screen over here and point to the man who attacked you, if you will." The computer screen you pointed to seemed relatively modern, but the photos currently being displayed looked as if they were taken by a retro camera. Regardless, it was as clear as day which one was Lenny. So without much thought, I pointed straight to his picture. "I see," said the sheriff in a concerned voice. I'll be right back." I immediately began to wonder if Lenny wasn't who he said he was, or if perhaps he was someone who had been wanted for quite some time. None of the scenarios running through my mind had prepared me for the old newspaper the sheriff handed me. Lenny's picture was on the front page, clear as day, but the headline read, "Local man Lenny Stringer, brutally murdered in his own home." Further down it continues with, "Around 12:04 a.m., neighbors reported yelling and screaming. No suspects have been named." I could immediately feel the color draining from my face. Was this some sort of sick joke the town liked to play on the newcomers to scare them off? This couldn't possibly be real. Sensing my disbelief, the sheriff broke the silence. "Yeah, this was a famous case back in the day. Poor Lenny was barely recognizable when they found him. They never did catch who did it, mainly because no one knew who would do that to Lenny. No need to worry though, that happened 100 years ago today. Even if the killer was a toddler at that point, they're dead and gone now." After this ridiculous story from the sheriff, I decided to ask for a ride home. Upon my arrival, I immediately started researching Lenny and this nonsense. There was no way what they were telling me was real, and yet, every news outlet I landed on seemed to confirm the sheriff's recollection, which was far more chilling than the town potentially being out to get me. As previously stated, this was a few weeks ago. I haven't been attacked, nor have I seen any sign of Lenny since that day. Credit where credit is due. I'm likely attack-free now since I heed Lenny's warning. Every night when I receive a knock at the door at 12:04, I ignore it. No matter what sounds are on the other side, I refuse to answer. No matter who is asking, and before you recommend simply abandoning the job and moving, this happens to me everywhere now. I dread the day when I accidentally answer the door at this godforsaken time, and find out what happens if I slip up a second time. This story takes place in 2007, when I was 9 years old. I live in Michigan, and it was the summer before I started 3rd grade. It was a tradition for my dad and I to go up north and spend a weekend visiting his buddy, who had a cabin on the lake, and this year was no different. I was excited, as I always was, but this time I was particularly happy that my dad's wife and her kids weren't going to be there. The driveway to the cabin was a long dirt road, with a smaller cabin and fireplace near the front. It's also surrounded by thick woods that stretches along both sides of the driveway, which extends about 100 yards until it opens up into a spot where people park their cars. Just beyond the cars was the bunkhouse, and beyond the bunkhouse was the front yard to the cabin. As we pulled in, my father reminded us that we would have to camp out in the front yard and sleep in a tent together because the bunkhouse was already being occupied by his friend's kids. I didn't mind at all. The sounds of nature helped me fall asleep. The sun was setting, and as we unloaded the truck, the leaves swayed with the breeze. The branches danced and cast shadows along the yard that occasionally changed when the sun dipped behind some clouds. The entire property was surrounded by woods and enclosed within a chain-link fence, with the front yard having a gate that opened up onto the deck. Once you were on the deck, there was a table and a grill to your left, and a doorway to the cabin on your right. If you kept going, you'd go down 4 steps and come across a hot tub to the left, and another doorway on the right, followed by a rickety wooden stairway that led down to the lake. After we said hi to everyone, my dad and I started pitching our tent. I glanced to the right and noticed there was a small clearing about 50 yards out in the woods. I didn't pay much attention to it, and we finished setting up the tent in no time. We then proceeded to join everyone for dinner on the deck, followed by a fire down by the lake. After a few hours of making s'mores and listening to everyone tell stories, we watched some fireworks that were set off on the dock. I found myself exhausted from the trip and started saying goodnight to everyone. I gave my dad a hug and started heading up the deck and out of the front yard. I unzipped the tent unceremoniously and crawled into my sleeping bag and passed out immediately. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but I could hear my dad snoring lightly next to me, so I assumed it was well into the night. One thing I picked up on right away was that it was dead quiet. Instead of hearing the normal summer sounds that I'm used to hearing at night, there was nothing. There were no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, not even the rustling of leaves or twigs as the nocturnal creatures came out for food. It was dead silent. I felt extremely uneasy, but then I realized why I had woken up. I had to pee. I slowly crawled to the front of the tent and reached for the zipper, hesitating for a moment before unzipping the door. I poked my head out and was met with the eeriest silence I'd ever heard. The moon was full and illuminated the trees and their branches as they sat above me silently. The sky was clear and the stars twinkled as they danced in the darkness. I slowly stepped out of the tent and felt the morning dew from the grass hit the bottom of my feet. I glanced up at the sky, just in awe at how clear it was. We never got to see the stars this bright back in the city, and I like to cherish the moments when I could. I walked over to the big oak tree that was just inside the fence and started doing my business. I lowered my head to the clearing in front of me, and that's when I heard it. Something howling like a dog off in the woods. The sound pierced through the silent night. Chills ran down my spine, and I froze in place as my head darted in the direction of the woods, trying to locate the source of the sound. I heard it again, a loud howling. This time it was echoed by a few more. What followed were the familiar yips of coyotes, and I was relieved. I saw them emerge from one side of the clearing and exit into the other. I stood there quietly as I observed the canines running and jumping through the clearing. When the last of them had disappeared, I tapped out the last of my business and glanced down to zip up my shorts. When I looked back up, I saw something I would never forget. There in the clearing, 50 yards away, was what looked like a coyote mixed with a human, and it was standing there on its hind legs, looking right at me. It had pointy ears, thick dark fur and a snout that was snarling, revealing a wicked set of teeth. And his eyes were yellow-orange, staring straight into mine. The thing that terrified me the most was its size. If I had to guess, it had to have stood around 8 feet tall. I was frozen stiff, but that quickly changed when the thing looked up and let out the most horrific scream I'd ever heard. Nothing about it sounded human. I tripped backwards over my feet and dashed back into the tent, zipping it shut, diving under my sleeping bag as I did. I then heard the grunt of a large animal, followed by the rattling of the chain-linked fence separating us, and then the unmistakable sound of feet hitting the earth. I closed my eyes tight and hoped to God this thing would go away. I laid there, trembling in my sleeping bag as I heard a set of 2 feet slowly stomp around the tent. After a few moments, I pulled my sleeping bag down slightly below my eyes, and I saw the shadow in front of the tent, his pointed ears tilted back as it let out another scream, before running towards the driveway of the cabin and disappearing into the night. I'd lay there in my sleeping bag, paralyzed by fear, hoping it wouldn't come back. After what seemed like forever, the sun finally came up. I asked my dad if he heard the screams last night too, and I told him about what I saw, but he assured me it was just a nightmare, and that no such thing existed. I dropped it shortly after, and kept the story mostly to myself, until now. I don't know what it was for sure, but I did see it, and I do know this: I will never set foot near the Michigan woods alone at night ever again. I motioned for Sam to follow, as we crept up to the large gate surrounding the allegedly abandoned mansion. Sam, who was visibly nervous about the situation, reluctantly joined me. There it is, Sam. The Thomas Mansion. I looked up in awe at the building. Being an adventurous teen, I had always wanted to go ghost hunting. So, of course, when I heard about the murder of the Thomas family, I knew I had to check it out. Sam fumbled with his camera, trying to ensure it was properly set up. I sighed in frustration. I thought I told you to be prepared. I'm sorry, Dan. I tried. I was tired. Now I noted Sam's messy hair and half-open eyes. This guy was always trying to sleep. At least he remembered the camera. I began to focus on my mission and started to move. Sam followed, and after a few minutes of investigating, we found a window which had been previously shattered. Now I crawled to the window first, then looked back. Sam was still peering through the window, his expression filled with worry. Sam, come on. Sam was visibly trembling. Do you really want to do this? Sam mumbled, his voice trembling along with his words. Yes, we're already here, just come on. Sam remained frozen in place. Irritation started to creep up within me, just as I was about to scold Sam again. A loud crash echoed from the other side of the house, causing both of us to jump. Sam, come on. Sam shook his head in refusal. I sighed and snatched the camera from his hands before venturing into the hallway, searching for the source of the sound. Guess you have to do things yourself if you want to get them done at all, I muttered to myself. I walked through the hall until I came upon a staircase, where a dresser had apparently been thrown down. It had broken part of the railing and caused damage to the tile floor during its descent. It didn't take a high-level intuition to discern that it was the source of the loud crash. Taking a moment to compose myself, I began my trek up the stairway. I was unsure of what lay at the top for me, but something deep within me tempted me to go up. The voice of curiosity that had brought me here continued to lead me. Just as I reached the top of the stair, I was startled by a loud, creaking sound. It sounded like the pressure of stepping on a creaky floorboard, but I was sure it wasn't my own step. Then I heard the opening of a door down the hallway. I turned my head to see where it was, but the darkness of the hallway shrouded any visibility. I reached for the camera to turn on the flashlight that it had attached, and quickly pointed it in that direction. The light revealed nothing but an empty hallway. Gathering up my courage, I began to walk towards the door that had been opened. As I walked, I began to consider what hadn't crossed my mind until this very moment. What was I looking for? The Thomas family had been killed by some maniac named Jack Henderson, and the psychopath had already been arrested. Whatever clues were in here are likely long gone. That's when the more obvious question hit me. Who else is in the house? Maybe someone else had come to snoop around as I had, but I found that unlikely. This was an active case, and the murder had only occurred a week ago. When I came here, the last thing I expected to find was someone else rummaging around and tossing furniture down the stairs. I stopped at the foot of the door. It was creaked open slightly, and something deep within my soul told me that entering this room would be the worst kind of mistake. The curiosity within me was waging war with my common sense. I could leave now, and no one would ever know. Or I could go face the abyss within this room. I started to think about what the killer had said when questioned about the murder. Jack Henderson's only statement on the matter was, "His will be done." There had to be more to this. I had to find out. I gently opened the door, the light of my camera illuminating what appeared to be a master bedroom, in which curtains and sheets were torn and strewn everywhere. Also notable was the stained blood of what I can only assume was the former Mr. and Mrs. Thomas. The feeling of dread had not entirely dissipated, but I tried to suppress it. My examination of the room found a lot of scattered, unimportant items, but then I noticed a piece of notebook paper on the nightstand. I reached out and grabbed the piece of paper, trying to discern the messy handwriting in the dark room. As my eyes adjusted, the message became clear. "Bad decision, Daniel." How did it... Wait, no, of course. It had to be a coincidence. That was my name. I never knew the Thomases, and I certainly had never been here before. The note must have been for someone else. I stuck it in my pocket just in case, and looked up towards the window. Who was the tall man watching me from the woodline? My question would not be answered, as someone grabbed me from behind, and I immediately kicked out and cried in fear. It was the police, of course. You don't go screwing around on a crime scene, start causing a ruckus, and not get caught, I suppose. I was really a stupid kid. Of course, they questioned me for a while, and eventually realized that I was just an idiot with a camera. A camera which was taken as evidence, of course. I was relieved. It seemed like everything turned out all right. The next day, Sam's mother reported that her son had been missing since the night before. Sam was never found. Stick around and part 2 will be out soon.